So, picture this. It's late 2025. The beautiful turquoise waters of the Southern Caribbean have suddenly become the stage for one of the biggest military buildups we've seen in decades. There was a serious crisis brewing. You've got warships on the horizon, and tensions are absolutely at a boiling point. Now, the official story is that this is all just a war on drugs, but as we're about to see, the facts on the ground, well, they suggest something much, much bigger is at play.
And really, it all boils down to this one huge question. What in the world is the USS Gerald R. Ford, the largest, most advanced aircraft carrier on the planet, doing in a region that usually only sees a handful of patrol boats? To figure out how we got to this point, we need to dig into the two very, very different stories being told right now.
All right, so first up, let's look at the official explanation coming out of the United States. According to the Trump administration, this massive deployment has a single crystal-clear objective.
So the stated mission is to wage war on these powerful drug cartels who the U.S. government now officially calls narco-terrorists. The administration's argument is that these groups are a direct threat to national security, that they're responsible for poisoning Americans and just destabilizing the whole hemisphere.
And things escalated, really fast. In January, key cartels get labeled as terrorist groups. By July, there's a secret order authorizing actual military force. Then in August, the bounty on Venezuelan President Nicolás Maduro's head skyrockets to $50 million. And then, in September, things go from tense to violent. The U.S. carries out its first airstrike in the region since 1989, sinking a vessel and killing 11 people. And just in case anyone thought this was a one-off deal, President Trump himself made the administration's intentions pretty clear with this chilling promise to the world. He was signaling that this strike was just the beginning of a much bigger military campaign. But as that campaign started to ramp up, the kind of military gear being sent in, well, it started raising some serious questions.
Which brings us to the second part of this whole story, the absolutely mind-boggling scale of the military force that's gathering in the Caribbean. To really get how unusual this is, you have to compare what's happening now to what's considered normal for this region. So, to put this all in perspective for you, on any given day, the U.S. presence here is minimal. We're talking a couple of warships, maybe a Coast Guard cutter. It's a pretty low-key patrol mission. But what showed up in late 2025? Yeah, it was anything but low-key.
An entire armada just appeared. We're talking about the world's biggest aircraft carrier, a whole group of destroyers and cruisers loaded with Tomahawk missiles, amphibious assault ships carrying over 2,000 Marines, a nuclear submarine, and then you look up, and the sky is full of advanced aircraft, from F-35s and Reaper drones all the way to long-range strategic bombers. You have to ask, doesn't that seem like a little bit of overkill for just stopping drug boats?
And it wasn't just ships and planes. By November, the number of personnel involved had swelled to around 15,000. This whole thing became the largest military buildup in the area that wasn't for disaster relief since the 1990s. So, how did the nation at the center of all this pressure respond?
Well, as you can probably imagine, the Venezuelan government did not take this lightly. President Nicolás Maduro's administration framed this whole U.S. deployment not as a drug bust, but as a direct threat to their very existence. Maduro came out swinging, accusing the U.S. of basically making up a crisis just to have a pretext for an invasion. He claimed the real target was Venezuela's massive oil wealth and painted his country as the victim of an imperialist plot, facing down the biggest threat in a century.
And in a big show of force, Maduro's government announced it was mobilizing its civilian militia. Now, most experts are pretty skeptical of that 4 million number, but the message was crystal clear. Venezuela was getting its people ready to resist a potential invasion, handing out rifles and cranking up the propaganda machine.
But, inside Venezuela, the story is always more complicated. While the government is trying to project this image of a unified country ready to fight, a lot of its citizens are just desperate for change. This quote here from a young mother in Caracas who is talking to American journalists, it just reveals this deep, deep desire for a different future, a feeling that is a world away from the official government line.
So all of this brings us to the other theory, the one that many analysts and even some former officials believe is the real story here. The idea that this has nothing to do with drugs at all, that it's really about regime change.
Think about it. If you deploy an aircraft carrier, strategic bombers, and thousands of Marines for a mission that usually just needs a few patrol boats, you have to ask, right? What is the actual objective here?
And this right here is the heart of the crisis. On one side, you have the public story from the U.S., fighting narco-terrorism,
And on the other, you have this growing feeling among experts that what we're really seeing is a classic case of gunboat diplomacy, designed to intimidate and ultimately topple the Maduro government.
And when you start looking at the evidence for this other theory, it's pretty compelling. First, the deadliest drug in the U.S., fentanyl, mostly comes over the land border with Mexico, not by sea from Venezuela. Second, we've already seen that the military hardware is way beyond what's needed for drug policing. Third, top U.S. officials have openly said they want Maduro out of power. And finally, that huge $50 million bounty, that's not just for a drug trafficker, that's for a head of state.
In fact, if you want to hear it straight from the source, listen to what the former U.S. ambassador to Venezuela, James Story, said. He put it about as bluntly as you possibly can. He said the military force gathered out there isn't just for show. It's capable of carrying out a decapitation strike against the Venezuelan government itself.
So the stakes are sky high. And the big question is, where does this all go from here? Because things are not de-escalating. In fact, the U.S. has taken some major steps to legally formalize this whole conflict.
This is a really important legal move, so stick with me here. In October, the White House officially told Congress that the U.S. is now in a non-international armed conflict. So what does that actually mean? Well, it's a huge deal. It legally reframes the targets from criminals into unlawful combatants. That gives the military the authority to kill them without needing to prove there's an immediate threat, which is a really significant and controversial expansion of power. And as you'd expect, these U.S. actions have completely split the region. Neighbor in Colombia condemned the strikes, but Guyana, which has its own border dispute with Venezuela, actually endorsed the U.S. presence. The wider Latin American community expressed deep concern, and global powers like Russia just called it excessive military force.
And maybe the most worrying part is that the danger is moving from the sea to the shore. According to U.S. officials, the Pentagon has already identified potential targets on land inside Venezuela. Places like ports and airstrips, they say, are used by the regime and the cartels. The chance of direct strikes on Venezuelan soil is becoming very, very real.
So we're left right back where we started, with this one fundamental question. Is this the world's most aggressive and heavily armed counter-drug operation in history? Or are we actually witnessing the carefully planned prelude to a war? The answer to that question is going to define the future of Venezuela and maybe the stability of the entire region.